Tremendous. Hello, welcome, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the fabulous Kenton Theatre here in Henley-on-Thames. We've got two very different audiences joining us for this session today. We have, first of all, our FIP Congress and Digital Innovators Summit audience who've been with us over the course of the last month viewing our conference sessions. And of course, we have our Media Reader Revenue Masterclass audience joining us for session 2 of 3. Those of you who were on the first session a month ago will know that that was an incredibly engaging and informative and entertaining session for an hour and a quarter, and we expect another one of those today. I am going to hand over to our host for today's session in just a moment, but just a reminder for those of you who are watching, first of all on Zoom, that this is of course the second of 3 masterclasses that we're running on this subject, and if you complete all 3, you'll be eligible for the certificate it shows that you've completed the course. And of course, a reminder as well for our FIP Congress delegates that if you want to go back and watch the first of the 3 sessions, you can do so on the FIP YouTube channel, which is FIP World on YouTube, and we will find a way to credit you for that course. The following session, number 3, which is about retention, will be on in October, and we'll be communicating the date of that very shortly. So I think that's enough for me. I'm going to come back later on with audience questions rather. I'm going to hand over now to our host for the session. It is, of course, our very own Martha Williams, CEO of World News Media Network. She's going to be driving the desk today. So over to you, Martha, and take it away.
Well, thank you. And we're really thrilled that all of you are attending from all over the world. The webinar is a partnership of FIP, one of the world's longest standing media associations based in London, and Mather Economics, the global leader in data analysis specializing in media subscription strategy and tactics. I'm Martha Williams, CEO of World News Media Network, and I'm moderating our session during FIP's Virtual World Media Congress. This session is the second in the series of 3 masterclasses about reader revenue, strategy, and tactics. If you attend all 3, FIP and Mather will award you with a certificate of completion. Mark your calendars for our next masterclass on Wednesday, October 14th, and please see the FIP website for more details. And now I'm excited to introduce our panel of excellent speakers and our robust array of topics, everything you need to know about reader engagement and how it impacts your subscription business. Our panelists today are Dr. Matt Lindsay, President of Mather Economics from the United States, Abby Spooner, the Customer Strategy Officer of Dennis Publishing in the United Kingdom, and Dan Gilbert, the Director of Data from News UK, based in London. I'd like to quickly run through our agenda for the day. You know what to expect. After this intro, our speaker presentation order will be Matt, then Abby, and then Dan. And after each of the speakers, we will field any specific questions directed to a specific speaker. And after all speakers have completed their presentations, we will have another opportunity for a longer Q&A with all the speakers. After the Q&A, FIP's CEO, James Hughes, will wrap up for us. So please note that the post-masterclass, we will distribute all the presentations and give you a link to the webinar. So, okay, let's get started. So here are the topics that we are going to look at today. First of all, the all-important pricing optimization and price elasticity by engagement level. Also, understanding and leveraging print and digital audience segments, engaging and profiting from the all-important COVID cohort. We all know that that's been a hot topic lately. Also, optimizing your engagement performance by launching upstream rather than waiting until it's time later on. You have to start earlier, in other words. Making lifetime value the goal of engagement, and last but not least, how to cultivate and drive reader habit formation. So all of those are really great topics, and here to start off is Dr. Matt Lindsay, the president and founder of Mather Economics. Go ahead, Matt.
Thank you, Martha. I wanted to just start talking about how do we actually define engagement. You'll here, and I think these other speakers will share their perhaps view on how they define it, but there's several variables that are often used in defining engagement. It has to do with how much content readers consume, the frequency of that, the nature of their visits, how often do they come, and how long are they there when they do come, and often the breadth of the content they're consuming. So we often will create a content index, and this is designed in a way that's helpful for analytics, and there's ways to do that. I'd be happy to share. If any of you have questions on how that's done, we'd be more than happy to do that. But the key there is, I think those variables that you see are often the ones that most people use. The topics in particular that I'd like to discuss today are really just these four things, and I'll spend probably the least amount of our time today amongst the speakers. I'd like to let them have most of the time, but I'd like to talk a little bit about how do we segment audience based on their engagement. What is the first most valuable thing you can do, which is to attach an identity to a reader, making them a known user or a known reader. The others are using engagement to predict churn. We find that's an incredibly helpful tool set to use. And then lastly, how does engagement affect price elasticity? So these are some high-level segments that we've defined using engagement. We often will have 6 segments, but these are the 4 primary ones that you'll see. You can see on these variables on the left, many of those are the variables I described earlier that we use to define engagement. So this is just a sample website. You can see that they're by far the most people are in the flyby category. These are people that tend to have very few page views, one visit per month on average. You can see when they come, they spend two minutes, a little bit over. They only scroll perhaps maybe a quarter of the way down the page. They have very little ad revenue. And you can see they have almost zero propensity to subscribe. If you go to the far right, you can see the group we call fanatics. Those are the ones that are the most likely to subscribe, but they're also much more valuable just from a pure advertising revenue standpoint. You can see they generate in this particular market over $1 a month, which is 9 times the amount of the next most engaged group. So there really are some economic benefits to engagement, and the other speakers today can talk about how techniques to build that engagement. But I'd like to talk about some interesting observations we've had, particularly during the COVID period. We found that there was, in many of our clients, a tremendous growth in subscription volume, new starts. And that was driven primarily by the growth in the percentage of users that fall into this fanatic category. So there was an incredible growth in engagement as the amount of COVID content grew. But interestingly enough, there wasn't a proportional increase in conversion rates. The numbers, the growth in conversions was really due to just the engagement level increase. We actually found that fanatic volume grew by three times its normal level, but the conversion ratio for those groups really stayed about the same. In fact, the conversion ratio for fanatics actually declined year over year, which is perhaps to be expected. But this is it's an interesting observation that really when you have events like COVID, they're going to drive a tremendous amount of engagement, and that can usually lead to some growth in conversions. However, what do you do to maintain your conversions during the absence of some big news story? And there are some ways we hope that you can use content analytics and such to grow engagement. So the next topic I wanted to mention was the value of converting readers from anonymous to known. So on the left chart here, you can see there's 2 axes. On the left, you'll have unique users, and then on the right, you'll see the conversion ratio. And what you'll see is that as all users in this particular market, they had almost 9 million unique users in a month. The high propensity segment was approximately 2 million of those. And then the known users were about 1 million. And you can see that the probability that a user would convert from that group is much, much higher. And so again, moving someone, even if they're not getting to the subscription phase yet, but just converting them from unknown to known is a tremendous advantage. And then on the right here, you can see the results of some machine learning model that we completed, where we looked at the factors that contribute to an individual's propensity to subscribe. And a known user, everything else being equal, will have a much higher propensity, even some controlling for some of these other factors that define engagement, such as page views, number of visits, and so on. So once you do have someone as a registered user or a known user, there you can see how this histogram shows the percentage that fall into different engagement categories. So Registered users compared to subscribers, as you'd expect, most people, as they grow in their engagement with the content, are more likely to subscribe. And so you can see that subscribers tend to have higher, almost a linear relationship. Just a much higher group proportionally fall into the very high engagement bucket, whereas registered users are in that kind of low to medium level. So the third topic here is really around pricing. And so how does engagement affect price elasticity? And this is a really important topic, because we're finding that most of our publishers now, that they've acquired numbers of digital subscribers, or even print subscribers for that matter, they're really increasing the average revenue per user is important, because you really have to have a profitable business. And it's almost, raising rates is a very important component of that strategy. So what we've found is, as you'd probably expect, is that as engagement grows, either price elasticity declines or your sensitivity to price. Here in this example, you can see that these fanatics and enthusiasts actually have very low price elasticity relative to those stable and below levels of engagement. So in this example here, we often will find that there's often a differentiated pricing strategy where people that are highly engaged could perhaps take a standard, let's say tiered price increase strategy, where you perhaps would come in from a promotional rate and go right to your basic rate, or on an annual basis have the standard increase that you might have. For people that are in that middle tier of engagement, you might want to have a moderated increase, where you perhaps take them in a staggered way or delayed fashion from the promotional offer to the basic rate. Or if you're having a renewal increase, perhaps give them perhaps a little bit less of an increase. And then for those that are not engaged, you perhaps don't give them an increase at all. We do have several clients that have what they call a sleeping category, where if they've subscribed but they haven't activated their access in over 90 days, they often will just eliminate or exclude them from a price increase, because the risk of that triggering a stop is too high. I did want to mention that we do have further reading available on this topic. We have this white paper here that you can access through the link when you see the document, or you can come to our website and find the document there. So just to give some additional data on the revenue per users, you can see that, again, you'll have different products. So we have a print product with activated digital access. You'll have a digital only product, people that are on the introductory rate, and then you'll have people that have made it to the basic rate or the full price of the digital product. And you can again see that there are some correlations between engagement and average revenue per user. So these are moving to the churn topic. You can see that the effect of engagement on churn. So these are coefficients that we've placed into this graphic, and what you're seeing are the incremental or marginal effects of changes in these factors on an individual's propensity to churn. So factors that reduce churn propensity are on the left, and factors that increase it are on the right. And so what I've done is I've anonymized these data so that you can't determine the publication here. However, you can see that engagement factors are prominent in the factors that reduce churn. So factors that if a customer, as their transition from a low engagement to a higher engagement, that transition is associated with a reduction in churn. The inverse of that statement is also true, and we find that a best practice, or one of the more effective tactics, is to use a deviation in prior engagement behavior to trigger a retention campaign. We find that some customers have just a standard level of churn risk that's high, and so continually sending them retention campaigns is not particularly effective. What you're really looking for are customers that perhaps are typically on a lower level of risk, that have an increase in risk due to perhaps a reduction in engagement. And that type of an event should be a trigger that makes them a target for a retention campaign. And this is my last graphic of this point, but I just wanted to mention that, interestingly, we find that different sales channels attract customers with different levels of engagement. A direct channel are customers that take an initiative on their own to come out to your subscription page. They can either do that by going to the subscribe here button on your website, or they can click through a newsletter offer. And those direct sales are typically customers that are the most engaged. Metered customers are those that have gone through their allocation of free content during a month or a period of time, and they've also read a certain number of articles, so they tend to be also fairly engaged once they've converted. Content that is dedicated as premium or restricted content, often those are readers that are very interested in reading that one particular piece of content, and they will buy a subscription, but they historically have not been as engaged, and thus you can see that after conversion, this is a chart showing retention weeks, and so this is almost 6 months after that conversion event. You can see that premium content sales the retention is about 50% in this market, whereas direct sales are about 75%. So again, looking at the acquisition channel is a pretty good indicator of what perhaps an onboarding messaging campaign might be, or people that are at perhaps a higher level of risk. So they should be perhaps the target of content recommendations or things that can build that engagement. So to conclude, I just would like to revisit the tactical recommendations that have come from this analysis. The first is to definitely consider some tactics to convert anonymous readers to known readers, usually through a registration wall. The next is to use engagement, the different metrics we've identified for engagement, to use those in some fashion to segment your audience. Again, those are key for indicating economic value, customer lifetime value, as well as advertising value for that matter. The third is looking at using engagement in your price elasticity calculations and considering different levels of targeted pricing based on engagement. And then lastly, to use retention campaigns when engagement may decrease. So customers have a deviation from their traditional pattern. I think some of these other speakers will talk to the difficulty perhaps in changing engagement levels, but nonetheless, we would recommend that it be something you consider. Lastly, I just want to point out we do have another white paper here that you can read that expands on some of these topics about engagement and how that affects individuals' propensity to subscribe. So hopefully I did not go to that too quickly. I would be happy to answer questions now or at the end. And again, I'll be more than happy to provide this document to you following this presentation. So thank you for the time today.
Thank you, Matt. I think there has been an interest already shown in those white papers that you mentioned, as well as your presentation. But I do want to ask you a question, because you just gave us a lot of powerful statistics showing what is working, what isn't, and kind of guiding media companies in the direction that they need to go. But I'm really curious, in all the hundreds of clients that you've had around the world, can you share with us, maybe without naming names, share with us some really great applications of those statistical models that you've shown us that really show that this really works?
Sure. So I think one of the more powerful insights we've had recently is how do you actually optimize a paywall model? We're not in the paywall business, and we don't sell paywalls, but we do help clients with their business rules around paywalls, and dynamic paywalls have gotten a lot of attention lately. And interestingly, people thought there was initially a linear relationship between engagement and content, that the more engaged customers should have the tighter paywall, and the least engaged should have the loosest paywall settings or get the most content. We've actually found that's not entirely the case, that there's really the optimal is more of what we often call a rainbow pattern, where you have the tightest meters at both ends of the engagement spectrum. The highest engagement customers should get a fairly tight meter because they're really engaged and ready to subscribe. The lowest engagement should actually have a tight meter because in many cases you really don't know who they are. They're very often the most anonymous of the groups, and therefore you really have a hard time modeling them accurately. So propensity scores will have a very high confidence interval. And what we've found is that when we go back and attach And many times people that appear to be flybys or unknown are actually people that have cleared their cookies or they're using another browser. And what we do when we go back and we see who actually converted, and we look at what we knew about them beforehand, we actually realize that a lot of people that appear to be unknown were actually known to us, and they had a fairly high engagement level. So what we find is that the highest, those people should really just get a tight meter as well, because you'll actually convert quite a number of them that you may not expect.
Great. Well, I know we'll be hearing more from you in our Q&A session at the end. Thank you, Matt. And I want to now transition to our next speaker, who's going to tell us about their engagement strategy at Dennis Publishing. That would be Abby Spooner, and she's the Customer Strategy Officer there. Abby, can you tell us more about what it is that you're doing with all the titles you have across the United States and United Kingdom?
Yeah, really good to be talking to you. Also great to come straight after Matt, who is basically, I think, the first three of his suggestions for strategy I'm going to be able to touch on within this presentation. I look after customer strategy at Dennis, and I'm particularly focused at the moment on how we drive engagement and loyalty to improve revenues and profit. So a little bit about Dennis. We're the second largest independent publisher in the UK. We're owned by Exponent, who are the private equity house that transformed BBC magazines into a media. And we are global, so we have titles right across the scale and right across the Atlantic. So we moved on from print versus digital, and we are in the train of moving to a very much more a customer-centric view. So looking for customer needs and finding solutions across all of these segments. Today, I'm mostly going to talk about our current affairs title, The Week, and also The Week Junior. But there are approaches that we're doing that are relevant to other titles across the portfolio. So what I'll cover, customer-centric journey planning, why the customer has to be at the middle of everything for it to work. It's also particularly front of mind at the moment, what's happening as a result of COVID and how we've used lifetime value as an engagement metric to drive that. And then a couple of case studies of what we've been doing at Dennis on the COVID cohort and then on the week. So all focused on customer centric and often around pricing and planning. So to start off with, this image comes from a article from Harvard Business Review called Competing on Customer Journeys, and the grey circle is the classic journey, so consider, evaluate, consider, and then buy. The loyalty loop is where we can, if we can get customers more engaged with our products or content from a digital perspective particularly, but also offline, this will be more profitable. Recurring revenue models obviously give you a step ahead of this, especially if you've got something like recurring payments set up, because you're already pushing people to opt out rather than opt in. However, it gives you a step ahead, but emotionally what we want to do is to take our customers around that blue loop, the loyalty loop. So this is the funnel, which I don't think I see a presentation nowadays which doesn't have a customer funnel on it. Our process is, as Matt described, it's about converting unknown to known through engagement, so the identify and nurture points. And then we move into what is effectively our traditional marketing piece, which is that customer transaction and conversion and the renewal stuff. So what we're really good at, and we've been doing for years at Dennis, is that converting customers and then renewing them effectively. Unfortunately, once we start going upwards, we have less metrics. This is a print product, and unfortunately, we haven't yet got live detail about whether someone has got to page 45 of the magazine yet, or whether they opened the magazine that was on their breakfast table this morning. But what we are doing is using the digital knowledge that we are starting to get about slides, about all of these behaviours, to start to identify how we take people through this funnel. The biggest thing that we've learned so far right across the board is that this is vastly different by brand. But all of that feeds into one thing, and that is the Dennis LTV model. It predicts revenue, circulation, profit, and return on investment. And it has basically become a structure that's used right across the business. So Charlene, who runs marketing on PC Pro, can use the LTV model to decide on what offer she's going to use on an email campaign. We can use it at senior manager level to start to choose where to spend limited budgets. And equally at a board level, we can look at it by title to think about where to place investment. So basically those inputs, cost per acquisition, take-through rate from trial to paid, details around pricing, what we know about renewals, about previous price increases, and then costs. So our LTV model is a profit-based one. So the outputs are not only the net acquisition cost, it's also looking at subscriber lifetime revenue, but also lifetime profit. And we build it in with price increases, with additional churn to understand the ROI. We're also in the stage of starting to look at it from a wider perspective as how you add extension revenues. So whether that is taking a print subscriber and converting it to a bundle, or whether it's getting someone who subscribes to the Week Junior to take science and nature. So that's the lifetime value model. And effectively, that's what we are using to predict, based on our knowledge of engagement, what is going to happen next and where to put our resources. So over to the COVID challenge, we used that LTV model to answer a lot of the big questions that were coming in. So our priority primarily was to our paying customers. So we had all of these focuses, making sure that customers don't have interrupted delivery. So we gave everyone digital access. We told everybody that nothing was changing, that we were really careful. There were lots of queries about people concerned about wrap titles, that sort of thing. That was the first step. So then we were really challenging all our acquisitions from an LTV viewpoint. We had to make sure, and we set a rule for a short period across the department, that all acquisitions had to have a 1-year profitable ROI. So that gave our team the ability to make decisions really quickly based on historical knowledge of churn and behaviour by channel. Was this channel something that we could do? So we dropped a load of channels that had poor response, but equally, something exceptional happened. Demand started to grow, and you can imagine with lockdown and schools closing, there were a lot of parents wondering how to keep their children engaged. And on all of our brands, but on the Week Junior in particular, we realised demand had grown massively. And we again used that LTV engagement prediction to justify spending on that conversion. So this graph here is orders and conversion rate on the Week Junior. And that element up until the first big spike was before the lockdown. And then you can imagine further on, everything was increasing. Order total more than trebled in 3 days. And also on another title, Cyclist magazine, we had a deal with Strava, which pivoted very, very quickly to being to say how far, not how far you can cycle around the beautiful British countryside, but how far you can static cycle in your living room in a certain period of time. It was the perfect partnership taking that moment. People were really, really engaged. The problem is with the COVID cohort, we don't know how they're going to behave. We didn't know how we could influence or whether it was even worth converting it at this point. But our LTV model gave us a maximum CPA to acquire these people at, so that we knew whether it was worth investing in it, and it was. So to make sure that we had continued engagement, we sent out a lot more onboarding comms. So a welcome note from the editor. We sent people access to the digital edition for free during the COVID period. And then we sent ongoing suggestions to parents, what to do with your children. Here's the Week Junior podcast, puzzles and quizzes, giving people things to do and focus on. On the Cyclist and Strava activity, it was a similar thing. Messages from the editorial team talking about what they were doing, talking about what was coming up, beautiful shiny coffee table books, which as you're sitting at home staring at nothing but your coffee table is quite a good solution. And we also approached these people on social as well. So on average, the Cyclist Legendary Climb Guide, which was one of the downloads, we actually found that people were not only downloading it once, but coming back and downloading it repeatedly. So there was, for all of these email comms, the engagement was huge, far higher than emails that we were normally seeing. So the second case study that I'm going to talk about is around the week. And Matt's already talked a little bit about how important it is to focus on price in tandem with engagement. And our challenge was this kind of big question: how long does it take for a new subscriber to develop a habit of reading the week that's sufficiently addictive to withstand a price rise up from that first year price paid? In previous years, we've kind of gone every 3 years, let's put the price up. But actually, is that the best approach? Because obviously it's a big trigger for churn. So what we started to look at, because we'd had price rises more recently, we started to look at how we were selecting different segments and what prices we would apply to those segments. The key metric we used for this was price elasticity to define the approach by each of those segments. So if you haven't come across that calculation, it's the percentage change in volume, so how many additional subs cancel, divided by the percentage change in price. So if price elasticity is less than 1, it means your customers are inelastic. So the lower the figure, the better. The more engaged your customers are, and the more they value your product, the lower this figure will be. So if a price increase of 20% meant you lost 20% of customers, that's up by 1. But if your price increased 20% and you only lost 5% of customers, that goes down to 0.25, which is very, very close to 1. We look back at historical price rises to try and understand what was happening. And what we found was that if we started to split out our subscriptions by tenure, this was the biggest proxy for having the details of inelasticity. So you can see those churn curves are all very much kind of from the older cohorts. There's an awful lot less churn, and people are tied very much into that. So we started to use tenure, because if you've been subscribing for 10 years plus, you are going to have a whole world of engagement that we probably don't know about, because again, your magazine is on your kitchen table. And we started to look at churn curves and what the optimum points of increase. And what we realized was that this graph shows not the renewal rates, but the variance between points in time. So what we found was once people reached the 30-month tenure, it meant that the churn was a lot lower. So we use this kind of metrics right across the board to identify specific tenure groups to go out to. Now, this is a lot of data, and marketers need to think about the customer. So once we've done that work, we then looked at real people. So we are looking at these 3 groups, the in-betweeners, so people who aren't trialists, but haven't been on the file for that long, who are much more price elastic, adopters who are getting tied in, and the loyalists who are people who've been on the file forever. And really, you know, they're the kind of people that if we make an even tiny change to the week, that they will be saying, don't change my magazine. But these are the people that marketers need to think about when they're talking to their audience. It makes those stats much more realistic. So finally, it's this thinking about customer perception of price increases. So there's a whole world of research that can be done around price versus value. Often customers think they pay cover price because that is the price that they see most often. It's on the front of their magazine. But actually how we pitch a price versus that price, how customers understand they are getting a discount versus that price is really, really crucial. And it's really interesting thinking about and working out what the maximum revenue per copy you can get from a highly engaged subscriber. And across the board, we've found that this customer-centric approach and using tenure as a proxy for engagement has been really, really effective. And it's also thinking about, do the subscribers see what they're getting as value for money? And that might change whether with the situation at the moment with fake news, people value the week more because it gives them an objective viewpoint. Finally, we use some real customer-centric approaches. So these are, if you've not come across a guy called Richard Shotton, he's written a brilliant book called The Choice Factory. He talks about behavioural economics and nudge. Here are some really simple things to think about when putting this kind of thing through. Make what you're saying easy, attractive, social, and timely. So if it's different, if you don't want people to change, make it more difficult for them to do it. Or if you just want them to click a button and say yes, make that super easy. Can they text it? Can they do it a different way? Test who messaging is coming from. So if you get a message from the editor, are you more likely to respond positively? We also found that if you when you tell customers their price is increasing influences what they do. The earlier you tell them, you tap into procrastination because you say, well, you don't have to respond for another 6 weeks. So then people don't tend to respond as much. Using precise discounts. So if you have something like a 10% discount, it sounds like something someone's chosen. If you have a 13% discount, that's much more specific. And then we're comparing per issue prices with things like coffee. It's all about pitching that price point. So finally, what we've learned, LTV is the most powerful tool in our arsenal. We need the data and we need to make sure everyone right across the company knows how to use it. The consistent pricing strategy has to be logical to a customer or it will get confused and it will drive churn. We think tenure is the biggest proxy for engagement, and we just have to remember this is about being customer-centric and not all subscribers will behave the same, even though we might want them to. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Abby. That is very thorough and fascinating. And we do have a couple of questions for you at the moment, but although we will probably have more later as well. So here's a question from Deanne. She asks, do you risk backlash if the loyal subscribers learn they are paying more? Do you have any way to ameliorate that?
So loyal subscribers will never be paying more than the visible price that customers see on our website. So that avoids that initial problem. I think subscribers generally accept that you might get a trial and in some cases a gift to sign up for a subscription. They probably got it then, and it does happen. People will accept that. Going forwards, we always make sure that although we are increasing price, the acquisition new price is always higher. Equally, if a subscriber calls up and says, I'm unhappy, I've seen these people are getting a gift, we'll send them the gift. It's all about sort of understanding our relationship to them and being transparent and honest with them.
Thank you for that. And so I wonder if you can give us maybe a little anecdote or two about the kinds of tactics you've used that surprised you that they worked. What were some engagement tactics that have really worked for some or all of your titles?
So I think the interesting element was actually going back to the COVID group. There were conversations about whether there would be delays in Royal Mail delivery. We decided to give digital access to all of our customers. We thought it was a big engagement piece, and it was really, really important to do that. We sent that out, and actually we had a fair number of people logging on, but actually what we realised as a result, we thought that a lot more people would immediately get the email, download it. Actually, there wasn't as much of a delivery problem. And quite honestly, I think people like print magazines. So you are, particularly with lockdown, there were less delivery issues and people were more open. So sometimes you try to be more engaged with people than they need you to be. Engagement has got to be on the customer's terms. And I think that's that particular part with the digital element has been really fascinating.
Great. Well, Abby, thanks so much for such a thorough presentation. I'm sure everybody's going to be looking forward to looking at that again later on. Now, we have one last speaker, and that is Dan Gilbert, who's the Director of Data from News UK in London. And he is a member of a product development team that's doing a lot of experimentation in the area of reader revenue and specifically today engagement. So I thought maybe, Dan, you could tell us all about the cool stuff you're doing at News UK.
Yeah, of course. And thank you, Martha. And so I'm Dan. I work for News UK. So we're part of News Corp globally, but in the UK in particular, we've got a range of media and publishing brands that, and I look after the kind of the data teams that run the various data science programs, data products we develop, and also the data governance side of things. In particular, today I'll talk about what we've been doing with the Times and the Sunday Times. And I imagine a lot of people are familiar with, sorry, let me just try and move this out of the way so everyone can see. So I imagine everyone's familiar with the Times and the Sunday Times, premium subscription publication behind a paywall, and has been behind a paywall for, I think, longer than most others in the industry. And so obviously kind of a big goal for us is when people visit the Times and the Sunday Times website in particular, is getting people to click on these buttons here. So starting their free trial. And then once someone starts their subscription, whatever pack they're on is kind of, as kind of Abby and Matt and everyone's been talking about today, one of the real key things for us is engagement. And most of us in the publishing industry, particularly on the digital side, talk extensively about the importance of engagement and habit. And as we saw in some of those very first slides of the session, there's a really strong correlation between the level of someone's digital engagement, so how often they use the websites and the apps, and their outcomes, so their levels of retention. So broadly speaking, engagement is a very good thing, and something that we have a lot of, we apply a lot of tactics and strategies to do to try and develop. I suppose the jumping off point for my talk today really is where we've tried to go beyond some of those headline kind of metrics and statistics that measure the levels of engagement amongst our customer base, and also really squeezing down the time frame for kind of where we kind of analyze what's going on with the new subscribers that we acquire. And so if you imagine somebody who's just signed up for the Times and started their free trial, the way we often try to look at the data, and we've been doing this more recently, is to kind of really understand what is that kind of sequence of activity that happens over the first couple of months of them being with us. And so in this particular example, this is an example of essentially the trajectory of engagement for an individual subscriber. So there's one dot for every day on which they've been active for the first 2 months of their subscription. And for those who are very astute, you'd probably work out that from those 56 days from the first 2 months, there's about 6 days where there's no bubble. And that basically means for this particular subscriber, they're a really, really strongly engaging new customer. They happen to not use a product on 6 days. I think we can forgive them that. This is a pretty good measure of engagement, but I think by any standards. And so if you kind of look at this particular subscriber here, that they've been having a positive journey, and they are one of a much wider cohort. And so we call this group our settlers. So this is kind of one of our core segments. And this is then an example of many kind of subscribers and their kind of trajectories over that first 2 months. And I suppose what's fascinating about this group is they seem to love the product from the moment they start using it. So from day one and thereafter, they're coming back, they're using the website, they're using the apps, they're reading content every day. And I think Matt was talking about some of the signals that are the best predictors of churn or retention. And whilst the number of articles you read and kind of the number of interactions, kind of commenting, sharing and things you do on the site and our apps is really important, the real kind of killer metric for us is the frequency of usage. So how often are you coming back? How often are you consuming content? Whether it's 5 articles, whether it's 20 articles. And so this is our gold cohort of settlers who come in and engage immediately. But not everybody looks like that as a new subscriber. And so unfortunately, there's a lot of people who come in and this represents a host of subscribers, and the sparsity of red dots means they're not engaging quite as much as we would like them to do. So on that kind of very top line, this new subscriber engaged by the looks of it 2 days, and that was it. We never saw them again. And there's kind of a subtlety here that we kind of changed our language a little bit over the past year or so of moving from talking about people who are purely dormant, so people who cease to use the product at all, and those who are nearly dormant, because once you kind of loosen those definitions, you actually get a much bigger kind of group that you start to look out. But in terms of their outcomes, so in terms of kind of the percentage of this group that will go on to churn, whether you engage kind of once and then never thereafter, or whether you came back 2 to 3 times, your churn outcomes are roughly the same. So ultimately for these people, the product is not working for them. I suppose that's the bad news. The good news is actually for a lot of these people who you don't really see again, they do come back occasionally. And so if you do have some kind of smart kind of marketing messaging or kind of or retention strategies, you don't lose everybody after the first day in this group. But these kind of show the polar extremes of our subscriber base. And I suppose the important thing is that for me really from this was when you start to visualize the data in this way, and kind of we took our inspiration from, well, kind of my academic hero who's done a lot of work in the healthcare sector, where they look at patient outcomes and really tracing how patients flow through a healthcare system. These kind of visualizations can really help build that kind of intuition into what's going on in a customer journey. But it also is kind of quite useful as just a sense check that if you're using kind of high level metrics that essentially give you an average view of all of your customers, the average between these 2 very different cohorts would be something in the middle that doesn't really describe either of them. And so back to again what Abby was saying, kind of segmentation is really important alongside using kind of pure metrics and averages around your customer base. But this is not everyone. There's then I guess what we call the messy middle. So people who don't quite fall into that gold star settler group, who love the product from the get-go and continue engaging. And they're equally not the people who go dormant or nearly dormant immediately. They're kind of they're the mix of people which fall then into kind of, I would say, like the long tail of other subsegments that we look at. So this is a group who I guess are kind of neither good nor bad. They seem to enjoy the product. They're engaging regularly, not quite as habitually or as often as we would perhaps like, but broadly so. The product seems to be working for them, and actually the churn rate associated with customers that look like this is probably somewhere between the settlers and the dormant group. So not bad, not great, but not terrible either. And then you've got other interesting groups that go through some kind of change in the nature of their engagement. So something happens and then something else happens, which means in this case, they stop engaging. And these are a particularly interesting group for us. For our marketing teams, trying to understand, is there anything you can do to kind of rescue engagement from someone who seems to be enjoying the product and then stop thereafter. And if you take a step back, and it seems strange in retrospect because it seems so obvious to us now, but it wasn't until we started to look at the data in this way that we kind of realized that, well, hang on a minute, the certainly for settler group, how they behave in the first week seems to be incredibly indicative of how they behave for the remainder of their first 2 months. And likewise for the dormant group, kind of the amount that you engage in your first week of your subscription is incredibly predictive of whether you come back and continue engaging again and again. And historically, a lot of our propensity models had waited maybe a month or 2 months or even 3 months to kind of look at a customer's engagement and try and make a prediction. And I guess this insight really prompted us to kind of really shrink that time frame that we do a lot of our data science and our modeling, from not just kind of at the end of the first month of subscriptions, a new customer's subscription, but down to the first week and actually even down to the first day. Because what that allows you to do is kind of turning things a bit on their head and moving from thinking just about kind of engagement and retention, but through to actual acquisition, is as you acquire customers kind of day after day, you can wait, for instance, 2 months to look at what was the kind of the positive engagement you got from those cohorts as you acquired them. But the problem is with that is you have to wait for 2 months to figure out what the health of that kind of customer is that you acquired. And kind of the insights from this work made us realize, well, actually, hang on, if you start to look at their kind of levels of engagement after just 1 week, you only have to wait for 1 week to find out, with a pretty good kind of overlap with what things actually happen in the end, the health of that new customer base. So kind of the engagement levels of a new subscriber at the end of their first week is a very, very good leading indicator of what their engagement will be at the end of the kind of first 2 months. And if you want to get really ambitious, but what I'm showing up here doesn't involve any data science, it just involves counting some kind of active days from your customer base. But if you want to apply a bit of data science to the mix, you can then try and actually predict the outcomes of those customers based on just the first day of their behavior. And that prediction will never be quite as good as kind of waiting to see, but it does a pretty good job. So kind of I've whistled through that, but I think the nice thing to see was that a lot of what we found really chimed with what Abby and Matt were saying. The real shift, though, that we've seen in our thinking is, if you are going to measure customer engagement, don't hang about. If you can do it after the first week, great. If you can do it after the first day, even better. Be really, really cautious with the metrics that you use. Average metrics are great, but they can sometimes fail to convey some of that nuance in the differences between your segments. I think what we've also found is, so between that settler group and that kind of dormant group, the group in between who don't quite get the product in the first week, but then who go on to engage really, really well, is actually quite small, which kind of to us suggests that trying to shift people from not engaging when they first kind of sign up to a product to really engaging well is actually harder than it might seem. And ultimately as well, if it is really about that first day on which someone engaged, or actually even the first session, you can't just rely on marketing. You have to build products people love from the outset, and products that people want to use. Engagement is not just about marketing, it's about building good products that people want to engage with. And also those leading indicators of the health of those customers you're acquiring, the faster you can get at looking at the health of that new customer base, the more quickly you can feed that back to your acquisition teams to then go on and find kind of more people like them, and ultimately find people who love the product. So a lot of this has really been around moving our thinking upstream, and I've stolen that term from a really, really good book by a chap called Dan Heath, and his book's called Upstream, and a lot of that is really about ultimately trying to solve problems before they happen, which is kind of featured heavily in our thinking, as well as kind of trying to build that more intuitive understanding of the customer using some of these kind of visualization methods. And so, yeah, all of this probably seemed quite obvious now once you know the answer, but certainly for me at News UK, it's taken about 5 years of slightly shifting from that kind of longer term view of engagement to the kind of the much shorter one. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Dan. That was great. And I think we're left with lots of questions about what specific projects you're working on right now. So I am aware that you were working on some personalization projects there, and I'm wondering, in terms of personalization, how much worth or how much value does it have in terms of engagement? And if you could talk about maybe some personalization ventures, could you do that for us?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I look after the data science team, so obviously I'm heavily invested in doing personalization work, because that's some of the most exciting work that a data science team can do. I think our key takeaway really is it has its place alongside the more segmented, curated stuff that your kind of talented and creative marketing and product teams can do. So if in particular for that dormant group we saw, we know that a lot of them will be coming in for a particular article or a particular kind of story that is going on in the world at the moment. We could just use personalization to kind of show those people more content that they may be interested in, but actually bringing in some kind of creative talents from our marketing and product and editorial teams to say, actually, we know there's 100 people who've come in for this particular storyline. This is stuff we really think you're going to be interested in the future, is actually a kind of powerful pairing of people and algorithms. So personalization is really important. It allows you to scale for all sorts of things, but never forget about kind of the talented people you work with as well.
Yeah, great. And I have one question specifically for you from David, who asks, what would you suggest to measure first for a reader revenue operation that has not been looking at data a lot?
I would start with, so I think probably two things. Start with active days. So if you're able to measure the engagement of your digital users, you could do a lot worse than starting with how often do they use your product. That would probably be my starting point. But the other one is the stuff that Abby was talking about. Don't forget about their lifetime value. So once you start to pair together the analysis I was showing with then what is the value of that customer in terms of the pack they were on, even though you're not using the product, maybe you won't churn for other factors. It can often start to change your perspective on what stories are driving revenue, what activities are driving revenue, that if you're just purely looking at engagement, you never quite get to. So I'd say keep it simple on engagement and then try and pair it with some measure of value for the customer.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Thanks so much for your presentation. I'm sure everybody's looking forward to getting a copy of that. Is that possible? Or
yes, of course. And yes, we write a lot about this stuff on Medium, so I'll be sure to share something there too.
You know, that's a good shout out, because I have read your articles on Medium and they're very valuable. So we'll try to point also to what you're doing on Medium as well. Thanks, Dan. Martha. So now we're going to shift over to some Q&A, and we have about 15 minutes or thereabouts to do that. So I'm wondering if I can just throw out a question to all of you. If you were talking about maybe talking to some media companies that are just getting started, that maybe don't have a lot of experience under their belt, but they really want to take their reader revenue strategy to the next level, particularly in the area of engagement. What would you recommend 3 tactics to take? Some of them maybe you've been talking about today, but specific tactics about how they can jumpstart the beginning of their strategy. Do you want to get started, Abby?
Classic Zoom error when I was muted. First of all, I think the biggest thing is you've got to nail your data. You've got to know what your renewal rates are. You've got to know what your churn rates are. And you've not just got to know it, but it's got to be super clear and usable and visible by everybody in the department. We've done a lot of work in the last sort of 12, 18 months about getting our results visualized in a way that everyone can understand them. And that's the first really big step. The second step is talk to your customers, get their feedback, research, understanding what is happening. But then it is working out, I think I would start off probably with mapping out customer journeys, understanding what each of the touch points are through that entire process. Define almost everything you can measure, and then pick a few. You might not pick all the right ones. You might pick some that but you've got to choose the right metrics. And you only do that by picking loads of metrics, trying to work it out. Start off by picking the ones you can measure and see if they're predictive. And then you've got the data to make really good decisions going forwards.
Great, thanks, Abby. How about you, Matt?
I think Abby's made some great points. I perhaps would recommend that it's really getting started. I think is the biggest thing. I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit when you first start. We see there's kind of a maturity curve organizations will go through where when you first launch a paywall, they often will capture those that are most engaged without too much effort, and then as you grow, you ultimately, that marginal subscriber becomes more and more challenging. So usually you don't start out with your lowest prices. I think sometimes it's come out with those people that you're going to capture first are usually the most engaged and not the most price sensitive. So give them an opportunity to subscribe, even if it's not a very restricted paywall. Just put a subscribe now button here. And so that's one. I think the other is registration walls, or as I mentioned, getting to know your customers. If you don't have a lot of data yet, those data are incredibly valuable. And the sooner you start, the more data you'll have. So I would definitely recommend that. And then lastly, I just think taking the friction out of the purchase process. We have a lot of clients who the least information you require of someone to make a subscription, the better. So just making it very easy. So I would say maximize your sales opportunities, reduce the friction, and perhaps just start by getting to know them.
Great, thanks, Matt. How about you, Dan?
So I think although engagement is hard to drive, you can do it, and often the place with the least friction internally to do that is with your marketing team. So if you do have a paywall, if you do have known kind of customers with permissions to market to via email and things like that, very often the internal logistics of getting some data through to being able to communicate with your customers in a targeted, nuanced way, the easiest place to do that is often through your marketing team via emails, or perhaps through your DMP, through some advertising. So I think that's often the best place to start, particularly if you've got a kind of a good champion in the business who perhaps owns that P&L, who doesn't have the complexity to navigate across multiple teams to partner with. That's often a good place to start. But I think then knowing the limitations of that, and ultimately you kind of need to be thinking about how you build the products that people will want to sign up to and pay for from the moment they see it. But as we all know, quite often trying to kind of get into technology product roadmaps to make changes and features in websites and apps is easier said than done. So quite often that's a longer burn, but I think you need to set your ambition to be able to really kind of change and update your product as well. But start where you can, get some wins.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I have one more question for each of you. Now, what we've all noticed in listening to your much data-driven presentations is that you guys are data people. But I'm wondering, since all of you work on teams or with clients that are actually implementing the entire strategy, I'm wondering if you can each of you tell us a story about how an engagement project went down. Not just from the data perspective, but also just from what kind of moving parts were there in that project besides what you're already talking about. For example, campaigns and the analysis of data and how it turns into or focuses on real people. How can you kind of color in for us the kind of work that you do in order to optimize your engagement strategy with a little bit of an anecdote or case study. Do you want to start, Abby?
Yes. So we thinking about the project that we're looking at the moment about turning unknown to known and launching reg walls. Just thinking, I was trying to scribble down all the teams that had to be involved in that, from publishing to editorial to technology to marketing to data teams to strategy to finance ultimately, and then it's got to be working and tied up and talking to everything else. So I think the biggest thing was that we coalesced around a strategy, but that strategy had to be pulled in from everybody, and everybody had to be engaged in pulling that project together. One of the things that I'm really aware of at the moment, and I think this is we're looking at this both in the UK and across the Atlantic. One of the things I'm really aware of is translation. I'm not sure whether having to do a lot of this virtually makes it worse too, but words, you think you're all talking about the same concept, but you're not. And you know, whether you're talking about building a model to do something or building some functionality, or how two pieces of software should be talking to each other, the actual translation and the communication and the language are the single most important piece. There's an element of, you've got to win hearts and minds to get everybody focused on that project, and you've got to be targeting people to achieve that project. That's the first part. But actually, take a step back, you need to all be speaking the same language, and we've had a lot of interesting conversations around that to try and get, this is exactly what the project is, this is what we are trying to do, effectively the mission statement.
Changing the culture.
It is.
Yeah, for sure.
Thinking about audiences, not products.
Yeah. Thanks very much for those insights. Dan, how about you?
Slightly to copy Abby's answers, I think all of what Abby said, and like as you kind of engage on these projects, that there's always niches of the business you realize you've never actually spoken to before, but ultimately you have to at some point. So when we start to look at lifetime value, it's colleagues in finance that we didn't even know existed, but we realized that if you're building these models, you have to make sure that they reconcile with finance's view. I think the big surprise for me with a lot of the work we've done around personalization has been the role of UX. So I think UX as a discipline, when it comes to kind of data and engagement and marketing projects, is often one that's forgotten. But there's a real kind of skill and expertise there to have someone who's slightly removed from technicalities of what you're doing, and being able to go and talk to the editor or the product directors or kind of people across the business to understand kind of, what does personalization mean for you? What are your concerns? How do you think the users would respond to things like that? I think a little bit of time from your UX team can go a long way, and that's something I've learned over the last couple of years.
Great. Thank you, Dan. And now, Matt, you and your team have worked with many companies of different sizes, sets of resources, challenges, strengths. What have you found in terms of bringing in all the different components to the strategy that you can recommend to our audience today?
I think Abby and Dan both touched on a number of things. I think the first reaction that, in our experience when people first started selling digital subscriptions, is they would put a paywall on a website that was originally designed for advertising inventory. And there wasn't a lot of consideration of what's the value proposition of the digital product, or what's the user experience, or what data do we need to capture. I think one of the really inspiring amount of innovation we've seen lately is using this data to quantify what is the value proposition to our readers, what do they want to read about, how do they like to experience it. And lately we've had people experimenting with selling ad-free subscriptions, for instance, and what are people willing to do for that. And some people like ads, which is kind of an interesting discovery. I think it has to do a lot with what are the, it's a whole new business. And I think both Abby and Dan mentioned that it requires a very collaborative environment. You have to have a lot of people doing a lot of things together to really do it well. And so that's, I think organizational structure is probably the kind of one of the unsung, factors that doesn't get a lot of attention, but probably should.
Yeah.
And that's true no matter how big you are, whether you're the, biggest of the big to the smallest of them out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Abby, Matt, and Dan, we are so appreciative of your expertise and your pointing us to being more innovative businesses. I'm going to now pass this to James to give us some closing comments. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Martha, for stewarding us excellently through that session. We appreciate that. And thank you to our guests for some fascinating insights. We do have a bunch of other questions, but I think we've run out of time, so we'll have to take those offline. Just a reminder that you'll be able to watch the video of this session on Vimeo for FIP Congress delegates and on YouTube at the FIP World YouTube channel. That will be up in the next few weeks. There is a third session in this series, a third masterclass where we're going to be talking about retention, and that is in October. Depending on how you signed up for this webinar through Zoom, you will get a notification of that from the same source that you got last time. But by far the best way is to sign up for the FIP newsletter, which you can do at fip.com, and then you'll be guaranteed not to miss the link to sign up for the next session. For FIP Congress delegates, we will be back tomorrow morning at 9:30 with a session with Everlytic. Promises to be very interesting. For those of you watching on Zoom, we will see you in October for Masterclass Session 3, the concluding one, after which you'll be able to claim your certificate having completed this course. But in the meantime, I just want to say another thank you to Martha and to Matt for helping us to pull this together, and to Abby and to Dan for their contributions and the hard work that they put into those presentations, both of which were incredibly insightful. So we'll see you all tomorrow or next month, depending on where you've come from. But thank you very much for watching, and we will see you then. Goodbye.